So if we put all of this together, if we go back to the classical view of economics, we have a major critique. And that critique is that the classical view and the neoclassical view really ignores the fact that markets are not self-contained. The first law of thermodynamics says that matter is neither created nor destroyed. What this means is that when you produce something, the inputs that you use to produce it don't go away. So for example, coal. If I'm a steel plant and I use coal to heat iron ore to refine it into steel, the burning of coal does not make the coal go away. It simply transforms the coal into another substance, namely coal ash. And the coal ash is not the only byproduct, of course, of coal burning. There's also a tremendous amount of CO2, methane, sulfur dioxide that is produced from coal burning. Well, the economic system, however, may not see the negative consequences of coal burning, because, think about it, the economic system sees the steel, it sees the iron turned into steel. It does not see the CO2 pollution, it does not see the SO2 pollution, it may not even see the fact that you're drawing down your resources of coal, and you have to find more and harder to And so now when you go to find more coal to make more steel, you may have to find harder and harder to reach areas for coal, which causes you to further and further degrade the environment. So aside from the emissions, aside from the extraction of coal, additionally, the market itself just does not have a way to handle this. Okay, so if you look at the circular flow here, you can see that a more honest approach is to include the fact that circular flow is going to have waste, right? Not everything is consumed within the economic system. You're going to exhaust resources as you grow your economy. Things like coal and oil, these are non-renewable. So over time, we're creating scarcity in these markets. But the scarcity in these markets does not necessarily reflect the actual level of resource exhaustion. And then, of course, pollution. Pollution is a huge outcome of economic systems. In fact, economic systems rely upon pollution. We don't really think about it this way, but without pollution, economic systems just don't exist. And so markets really, almost by definition, are going to ignore these particular issues, because notice that these are being spit out of the economic system. They're not being made to go back into it. And so if all of these decisions are being made in this positive feedback loop, right, the circular flow of the economic system, but in reality there's all this additional cost that's being driven out of the economic system, then the decisions being made inside of it will not reflect these particular issues. And this is very problematic. This is problematic because these issues affect other individuals. Things like waste, things like pollution, reduce the utility and profits of other individuals in the economic system. So therefore, we have to, if we're being honest about true accounting of economic benefits and economic cost, we would need to factor these in to our circular flow in order for us to have a real, honest assessment of what's going on in economic systems. And so, as you go from classical to neoclassical to welfare, all right, the sort of crux of environmental economics is that we take that classical view of the circular flow, but we recognize that not everything that is produced from the circular flow makes it back into the circular flow, that there are these costs and damages and loss of profits that are created by things like waste, resource exhaustion, and pollution. And for policymakers, if they ignore these things, then it means that they're allowing utilities and profits to fall while they grow the economic system. Now again, remember, the whole point of this argument is trying to achieve the highest level of human prosperity. But if you're ignoring things like waste and pollution and resource exhaustion, then you're not likely obtaining the highest level of human prosperity. And so that's kind of the main argument here that we have at the very beginning of this class, is that the traditional view of economic systems, classical, neoclassical views of economic systems, ignore that sometimes the costs and damages of economic growth are not contained in the economy, that they make their way outside of the economic system, and that therefore the decisions that are being made inside of the economic system will be ignorant of those issues and therefore will not factor them in. I mean, take the consideration of just trying to grow an economy and using something like GDP, gross domestic product. There's nothing in the calculation of gross domestic product, right? All of the things made by a country in a given year, there's nothing that says minus environmental cost, minus resource exhaustion, minus waste, right? That's not the way it works. GDP is just the amount of stuff produced in a country in a given year. So if you grow yourself by trying to grow GDP, if that's your main policy parameter, I'm going to grow the economy by maximizing GDP growth, you are going to ignore a host of environmental issues because you're not factoring them into the strategy of how you're growing your economy. And this is really where we find ourselves in the modern era. After years and years and years of attempting to grow our economy, most notably during the Industrial Revolution, we are now sort of struck by the degree to which we have at times degraded the environment, to the extent that, in fact, what will ultimately happen, most likely, is that environmental degradation will eventually erode an economy's ability to grow itself. This is seen easily with resource extraction, right? If I'm pulling coal or oil or whatever the substance is out of the ground, if it's a non-renewable resource, at a certain point, I run out of that resource. But more than that, take something like pollution. If I grow my economy through heavy industrial production, but that heavy industrial production reduces my stock of available clean water, then I've grown my economy, but I don't have water to drink anymore. And so my citizens could potentially suffer from that. We, of course, have seen this most recently with the Flint, Michigan experience. And so the thing that we have to ask ourselves is what is the price of economic progress? And being very circumspect about the entire thing, in what context does paying attention to environmental issues in fact lead to long-run economic growth that would be higher, in fact, than if we were to ignore environmental issues? This is really the mainstream economic view in the current era, that environmental issues are extremely important, not only because of how economic growth causes them, but they're extremely important in terms of their potential effect on future economic growth. This leads us to an interesting set of economic theories, mostly centered around the concept of market failures. We have the early forms of market failure, which were mostly about market power, so monopoly power and things like this, with economists Cournot and John Nash. Other forms of market failures are asymmetric information, most famously described by George Akerlof. These are situations in which people lack information to make rational decisions. And so if people lack information to make rational decisions, then we can't expect economic systems to therefore be efficient. What we're mostly going to be focused on in this course are two sets of market failures. The first is called an externality, which was sort of first thought up by the economist Pigot. This describes the first law of thermodynamics, as I mentioned previously, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. And the second is called a public good, first sort of like thought up by Paul Samuelson and Elinor Ostrom. And within public goods, we have two kind of main problems. We have the tragedy of the commons, sort of first kind of thought up by Garrett Hardin, and then the free rider problem by Baumol. And all of these particular issues, specifically externalities and public goods, relate to modern environmental economics. So they're really kind of the main thrust of what we're going to talk about in this particular class. Externalities deal with the fact that, just like I said previously, sometimes damage makes it outside of economic markets, and so therefore they will ignore that particular damage. Public goods deals with kind of a whole other issue in which the nature of some goods renders markets unable to deal with them. And when that's the case, again, we can no longer expect markets to solve the sort of human prosperity issue. And we're going to get to these as we go through the class more. I now want to bring us back. And I want to talk about Thomas Malthus for a moment. So Thomas Malthus is often considered a classical economist, but he is probably the first economist to ever really discuss the issue of sustainability. Thomas Malthus creates what we call the Malthusian trap, or the Malthusian catastrophe, in which as economic growth occurs, population growth will also occur, which is completely true. That's what we see throughout history. As economic growth goes up, so does population growth. Medical technology is usually the reason given for that, but also just that there's more opportunity as well. Like as population grows, there's more jobs, there's more opportunity, so on and so forth. What Malthus was concerned with was that eventually the needs of the increasing population would outstrip the ability of society to provide for that increasing population. So he in fact said that population growth was geometric or exponential, as you can see here in the graph with the train. So population growth skyrockets around the 1700s and all the way through to today, where we're experiencing a population increases over the last 100 years that are really kind of almost unbelievable. But that the issue was that the ability of society to provide for itself primarily through food was going to be unable to be maintained. In other words, that there would be so many individuals that we wouldn't possibly be able to provide for all of them. Now, the issue is that the Industrial Revolution happened. So again, Malthus is sort of late 1700s. He doesn't see the Industrial Revolution happening. And unfortunately, Malthus is kind of forgotten about because people look at his worry regards to population growth and they don't see it occur, at least in advanced economies. The fact is that if you look at less advanced economies, if you look at developing economies, they absolutely have issues related to population growth and absolutely have had famine situations in which very clearly they had a hard time providing for their growing populations. And so while Malthus may have not been quote-unquote correct with respect to an advanced economy, it's clearly the case that what Malthus brought up as a concern, population growth, is very much something that we should be concerned about, and especially with respect to pollution. Given that our economic systems are market-based, and given that therefore they are consumption-based, this would imply that as population grows, things like pollution, waste will also grow as well, unless we fundamentally change the systems under which we consume products. We have not really done this. If you look at especially the U.S. wastes more food than any other country on Earth, and to an unbelievable degree. In fact, we'll give some statistics on the first day of class on June 4th about these particular topics. But even if you just look at the waste issue itself, clearly there's a problem with respect to the number of individuals and the amount of products that are being consumed, in the sense that we don't really have a problem providing for individuals now. Even in places where people have food insecurity, it would actually be relatively easy to get food to those individuals, but oftentimes there's political or legal processes that prevent it, that from occurring. And the fact is that there has to be a recognition that as population grows, the ability to grow the economy to maintain a particular level of human prosperity becomes harder and harder. It doesn't mean that countries can't do it, and it certainly doesn't mean that countries haven't been able to do it, but the ability to do it over the long run is incredibly difficult and very tricky, and requires policymakers to be very nimble in confronting particular issues. And population growth is something that we'll talk about a lot in class.